January 17, 1946. Nuremberg, Germany. The morning light filters through barred windows, casting long shadows across a stone floor still cold from winter's grip. In a dimly lit interrogation room within the Palace of Justice, a man sits alone at a wooden table, his hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of secrets he has carried for 6 years. His name is Oberst Heinrich Müller, not the Gestapo chief, but another Müller, one whose name never appeared in newspapers, whose photograph exists in no archive. He is a ghost in the machinery of the Third Reich, a handler of ghosts. And today, for reasons even he cannot fully articulate, he has chosen to speak. The stenographer's pencil hovers over paper. An American intelligence officer leans forward, his face betraying nothing. Outside, the trials proceed with their grand theatrical justice, but here, in this forgotten corner of history's reckoning, another kind of truth is about to emerge, one that will remain classified for decades, buried in files marked with stamps that promise secrecy until all the players are dust. Müller begins to speak, and his words carry the accent of a man educated in universities, not training camps. He describes a network that never existed in official records, agents who moved through Allied territories like water through paper, invisible until the damage was done. But these are not the spies the tribunals are prosecuting. These are the ones who were never caught because they were never suspected, the ones whose names he committed only to memory, whose faces he met only in darkness or disguise. This is the story of that confession, and of the revelation that would force American intelligence to question everything they thought they knew about the war they had just won. In the autumn of 1939, as Europe plunged into the abyss of war, the intelligence apparatus of Nazi Germany was already reaching across oceans with tentacles invisible to the untrained eye. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, operated under the leadership of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, a man of contradictions, later suspected of harboring sympathies toward the resistance, yet responsible for building one of the most sophisticated espionage networks the world had ever seen. Beneath him worked hundreds of officers, each managing cells of agents scattered across continents. But not all of these officers operated within the documented hierarchy. Heinrich Müller had been recruited in 1938, not from the ranks of the military but from the academic world. A professor of linguistics at the University of Heidelberg, he possessed a gift for languages and an encyclopedic knowledge of European and American cultures. His specialty was not explosives or sabotage, but something far more subtle: the construction of believable identities. He could take a German national and transform them, through months of careful coaching, documentation forgery, and psychological conditioning, into a perfect replica of an American businessman, a Belgian journalist, a Polish refugee. His work was so meticulous that even native speakers could not detect the deception. The Abwehr gave him a small office in Berlin, away from the main headquarters, and a budget that required no accounting. His instructions were simple: create agents who could not be traced back to Germany, who could live among the enemy not for weeks or months, but for years. These would not be the dramatic spies of legend, planting bombs or stealing blueprints. These would be the patient ones, the ones who would watch, listen, and report on the subtle movements of industry, the whispers of political sentiment, the slow turning of public opinion. They would be eyes that never closed, ears that never stopped listening. By 1940, Müller had placed 17 such agents throughout the United States, Britain, and neutral countries. None of them appeared on any Abwehr roster. Their communications were routed through intermediaries so obscure that even Canaris himself did not know their full extent. They were Müller's private network, his masterpiece of operational security. And they were devastatingly effective. Son. What Müller expected was what every German intelligence officer had been trained to expect: that maintaining deep cover in enemy territory would be a constant exercise in vigilance and deprivation. In the Germany of his experience, resources were allocated, rationed, controlled. Information flowed through channels that could be monitored. Loyalties were enforced through fear or ideology. He assumed the Allied nations would operate similarly, that his agents would need to navigate a landscape of suspicion, restriction, and scarcity. What they found instead was something that no amount of training had prepared them for. Abundance so overwhelming it was almost insulting. Freedom so careless it seemed like a trap. Agent Wilhelm, a man Müller had spent 8 months transforming into William Burke, an insurance salesman from Milwaukee, sent his first coded message from New York in February 1940. Müller, reading it in his Berlin office, initially suspected it was disinformation, a sign that Wilhelm had been compromised and was being forced to write under duress. The message described shelves in grocery stores stocked with goods Wilhelm had not seen in Germany since before the Depression. Meat available without ration cards. Coffee sold in such quantities that it sat in bins, scooped out by the pound. Butter, sugar, chocolate, all of it just sitting there, available to anyone with money, and the money itself seemed to flow with disturbing ease. Wilhelm wrote in carefully coded language that he had attended a community gathering at a church, a reconnaissance exercise to understand local social networks. But the gathering had served a feast that would have been considered extravagant by German standards even before the war. Roasted chickens, fresh bread still warm, pies made with real fruit and cream. And this was not a celebration of anything particular, not a holiday or special occasion. This was simply what Americans did on a Wednesday evening in February. Müller filed the report, made a note about possible exaggeration due to psychological adjustment stress, and waited for Wilhelm's next communication. It came 3 weeks later and said essentially the same thing. Then came reports from Marie in Chicago, from Friedrich in Detroit, from Hans in San Francisco. All of them, independently, reported the same bewildering reality. The American homeland was not merely unscathed by war, it was thriving with an almost offensive indifference to the suffering that consumed Europe. The records Müller kept, which he handed over to his American interrogators in 1946, contain a phrase that appears repeatedly in his annotations: abundance as weapon. He had begun to understand, even as early as 1940, that the United States possessed a form of power that could not be bombed or blockaded. It was the power of casual plenty, of a society so wealthy that even its working classes lived in conditions that German professionals could only aspire to. And this abundance had a psychological effect that Müller had not anticipated. It made his agents question their mission, not through coercion or counterintelligence, but through simple exposure to an alternative way of living. Fatz. Agent Wilhelm, whose real name was Klaus Richter, a detail Müller revealed only under direct questioning, had been a dedicated National Socialist when he left Germany. The son of a minor party official, raised on the rhetoric of Aryan superiority and German destiny, Klaus had volunteered for intelligence work with genuine enthusiasm. He believed in the mission. He believed that the decadent democracies would crumble when confronted by disciplined German will. His first assignment was to embed himself in the insurance industry in New York, to observe the financial networks that connected Wall Street to Washington, to report on industrial production and shipping movements. For the first 6 months, he executed his duties with precision. His reports were detailed, timely, and valuable. Müller considered him the best of his recruits, but something changed in the summer of 1940. Wilhelm's reports became less frequent, though no less detailed. The tone shifted subtly. He began including observations that had no intelligence value, descriptions of baseball games attended, of conversations overheard in diners, of a weekend trip to the Catskill Mountains where he had stayed in a modest cabin that nonetheless had running water, electricity, and more space than his family's apartment in Berlin. In October, Wilhelm sent a message that Müller nearly burned upon reading. It was a philosophical reflection, poorly disguised in commercial code about the nature of governance. Wilhelm had been to a town hall meeting in New Jersey where citizens openly criticized their mayor, their governor, their president. They shouted at elected officials, called them fools, demanded accountability, and nothing happened to them. No arrests, no disappearances. The officials actually responded, defended their positions, promised to do better. The meeting ended, and everyone went home. Wilhelm wrote, "Yeah, I do not understand how a system this chaotic functions, but it does function. And the people here do not seem to realize how extraordinary their chaos is." Miller, reading this in a city where a careless word could mean death, felt something crack in the foundation of his certainty. He sent a coded message to Wilhelm reminding him of his mission, his duty, his loyalty to the fatherland. Wilhelm responded promptly, professionally, with detailed intelligence on shipping schedules at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but the crack remained, and it grew wider with every subsequent report. By 1941, Miller was managing a network that was slowly disintegrating, not through enemy action, but through something far more insidious: doubt. Agent Marie, a woman named Greta Zimmerman who had been placed as a secretary in a Chicago manufacturing firm, sent a report in March describing how her employer had given her a Christmas bonus, 2 weeks extra pay, simply as a gesture of appreciation. In Germany, such generosity would mark the giver as either foolishly wealthy or politically motivated. Here, it was standard practice. She wrote that her co-workers discussed their wages openly, compared them, negotiated for more. They spoke of forming a union without fear of imprisonment. The factory owner did not want a union, argued against it, but did not send thugs to beat organizers in the night. Greta's reports became increasingly focused on these small observations of freedom. She described going to see a film, The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's satire of Hitler, in a theater filled with Americans who laughed at a mockery of the Führer that would have resulted in execution in Germany. She sat among them, pretending to laugh, and felt a terror that had nothing to do with exposure. The terror came from realizing that these people felt safe enough to laugh at dictators because they did not live under one. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the war entered a new phase of brutality that would ultimately consume 27 million Soviet lives. News of the invasion reached America through newspapers that printed photographs of destruction, maps showing German advances, and editorials debating whether the United States should involve itself in Europe's carnage. Americans read these accounts over breakfast in diners where eggs and bacon and orange juice were served without thought of shortage. They discussed war while safe from its reach, a luxury that Müller's agents found increasingly difficult to resent on Germany's behalf. Agent Friedrich, stationed in Detroit to monitor automobile production that would soon convert to tank and aircraft manufacturing, sent his final useful report in August 1941. After that, his communications became sporadic and filled with personal observations that violated every principle of tradecraft. He described befriending his neighbors, attending a 4th of July celebration, eating food cooked on outdoor grills while children played in yards, and fireworks, explosives used for entertainment, burst overhead in celebrations of independence. In October, Friedrich sent a message that Müller knew immediately was a resignation, though it never used that word. Friedrich wrote that he had met a woman, that he was considering marriage, that he had saved enough money to consider starting a small business. He added, almost as an afterthought, that the Ford plant had increased production of aircraft engines and expected to double output by spring. Then he signed off with the agreed-upon code phrase that meant "message complete and await instructions." Müller sent no instructions. What could he say? He sat in his Berlin office where winter was arriving early and cold, where coal rations had been cut again, where every conversation was shadowed by the possibility of denunciation, and he tried to compose an order to an agent living in a country where a factory worker could dream of owning a business. The words would not come. He filed the message and moved on to managing the agents who still seemed reliably committed. The historical record, pieced together from Müller's confession and corroborating documents later declassified, reveals a pattern that Allied intelligence had failed to recognize during the war: the quiet disappearance of deep-cover German agents not through arrest or exposure, but through assimilation. Of Miller's 17 primary agents, only 3 were ever caught by American or British authorities. 2 others died in accidents unrelated to their espionage activities. The remaining 12 simply faded into American and British society, becoming the identities they had been trained to simulate. Wilhelm Klaus Richter continued working in insurance throughout the war. He married an American woman in 1943, a Jewish refugee from Austria who never knew his true identity. He attended synagogue with her, learned her prayers, and after the war, when he could have returned to Germany, he chose to stay. His children grew up as Americans, unaware that their father had once been trained to undermine their country. Klaus died in 1979, having never revealed his past to anyone except, presumably, in his conscience. Marie, Greta Zimmermann, became a union organizer. The irony was not lost on Müller when he learned of it during his interrogation. The woman he had sent to observe American industry from Ciao within had instead joined the workers' movement, fighting for better wages and conditions with the same dedication she had once reserved for the Reich. She was arrested once during a strike in 1943 and spent 3 days in jail for blocking the entrance to a factory. She considered it a badge of honor. After the war, she worked for the Congress of Industrial Organizations and lived to see the merger with the AFL. She never returned to Germany. Friedrich, the agent whose name Müller refused to reveal even under interrogation, one of the few secrets he kept, disappeared entirely from German records in 1942. American intelligence suspected he might have voluntarily approached the FBI with an offer to become a double agent, but no record of such recruitment exists in declassified files. What is certain is that someone matching his description operated a successful tool and dye shop in Michigan throughout the 1950s and donated generously to veterans organizations. Whether this was Friedrich or simply a coincidence, Müller would not confirm. The symbolic object that runs through Müller's confession, appearing again and again in the reports he saved and the memories he recounted, is bread. Not the coarse, heavy black bread of German rationing, stretched with sawdust and potato flour, but the soft white American bread that his agents described with something approaching reverence. Wilhelm wrote of sandwiches made with bread so soft it compressed under gentle pressure. Bread that served as a mere vehicle for meats and cheeses piled in quantities that constituted a full meal themselves. Marie described bakeries with windows full of breads, white, wheat, rye, sourdough, all available without ration cards, without queues, without the daily anxiety of scarcity. Bread became, in Müller's mind, the symbol of everything his ideology had failed to account for. The National Socialist promise had been for security, strength, glory, a 1,000-year Reich built on discipline and sacrifice. But his agents, living among the enemy, discovered that the chaotic democracy they had been taught to despise produced something Germany could not. Enough. Enough food. Enough space. Enough freedom to complain, to dream, to choose. In one particularly revealing passage of his confession, Müller described receiving a package in early 1943. It had been smuggled through neutral channels by Wilhelm, who had included no message, no explanation, just a loaf of Wonder Bread, somehow preserved enough to remain recognizable despite its journey. Müller unwrapped it in his office and stared at the soft white slices, each one identical, wrapped in waxed paper printed with cheerful primary colors. He understood it as a statement, though Wilhelm never confirmed this. This is what you are fighting against. This abundance, this careless, effortless plenty. Müller kept the bread in his desk drawer for 3 days before hunger and curiosity compelled him to taste it. He expected it to be bland, artificial, inferior to proper German bread. It was all of those things. It was also available to every American, every day, without sacrifice or suffering. And that, Miller admitted to his interrogators in 1946, was when he began to understand that Germany had already lost the war, though the fighting would continue for 2 more years. Shokti, the transformation of Miller's network from intelligence asset to liability occurred gradually, but the turning point can be traced to December 7, 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later, Miller's agents suddenly found themselves in a nation transformed overnight from cautious neutral to fully mobilized combatant. Miller expected this to make his agents' work more difficult, more dangerous. He expected them to go silent, to lie low, to wait for the initial fervor to pass. Instead, his agents reported something unexpected. Americans, despite their anger and fear, did not descend into the totalitarian reflexes that characterized German society. Yes, there were shameful exceptions, the internment of Japanese Americans being the most egregious. But Wilhelm wrote of his German-American neighbors who continued living openly, speaking German in their homes, worrying about relatives in Germany but not facing systematic persecution. He wrote of debates in newspapers about civil liberties, about voices arguing loudly that even in wartime, constitutional rights must be preserved. The war effort itself produced observations that further eroded the ideological certainty of Miller's agents. Agent Peter, stationed in Los Angeles and assigned to observe the aircraft industry, sent reports describing factories that operated with stunning efficiency, despite, or perhaps because of, the diversity of their workforce. He wrote of assembly lines staffed by women, by Black Americans, by recent immigrants, all working together to produce bombers that would rain destruction on German cities. The Nazi ideology taught that such diversity produced weakness, chaos, inefficiency. Peter's reports proved the opposite. The factories worked around the clock, production numbers climbing month after month, output that would eventually overwhelm Germany's capacity to respond. In one particularly detailed report from early 1943, Peter described attending a concert organized to raise money for war bonds. The performance featured Jewish musicians playing German composers, Beethoven, Wagner, while the audience, including many German immigrants, listened and then donated money to fight Germany. The complexity of this scene, the layered ironies and contradictions, seemed to break something in Peter's ability to maintain his cover psychology. He wrote, "They have taken everything we said was ours, our music, our philosophy, our science, and they use it better than we did. They don't need purity. They don't need conformity. And somehow, impossibly, that makes them stronger." Miller read these reports in Berlin as the city began to experience the first sustained Allied bombing campaigns. The air raid sirens, the nights in shelters, the growing lists of casualties, all of it lent a bitter context to his agent's observations about American abundance and freedom. His office, once a place of quiet academic precision, became a cell where he confronted the slow collapse of every certainty he had built his life upon. The historical evidence supporting Miller's confession came not from German records, most of which were destroyed in the final days of the war, but from a meticulous process of verification conducted by American intelligence after his surrender. Counterintelligence officers, initially skeptical of his claims, began investigating the identities Miller provided. They found Wilhelm working in his insurance office in Manhattan, exactly where Miller said he would be. They found Marie in Chicago, her union credentials genuine, her history as a German agent never suspected. They found the others one by one, living lives that had become real. The interrogators faced an unprecedented dilemma. What to do with enemy agents who were no longer enemies, who had become, through exposure to American life, more American than many native-born citizens in their embrace of the nation's values? Some argued for prosecution, for public trials that would expose the extent of German infiltration. Others recognized that such trials would reveal an uncomfortable truth, that American society had been so confident, so open, so abundant that it had simply absorbed enemy agents and transformed them through ordinary daily life. In the end, a decision was made at the highest levels of government, a decision that remained classified until the 1980s, to leave Miller's network undisturbed. The agents were quietly monitored, but not arrested. Their assimilation was deemed more valuable than prosecution. They had become, in effect, proof of concept, evidence that American democracy possessed a kind of cultural gravity that could capture even those sent to destroy it. Miller himself was held in custody for 18 months, his confession documented, his intelligence value assessed. In 1947, he was quietly released, not repatriated to Germany, but granted entry to the United States under a new identity. The reasoning, according to declassified memos, was that his expertise in creating false identities might prove valuable in the emerging Cold War. But there was another, unspoken reason. Miller had become one of his own creations, a man caught between identities, no longer fully German, but not yet anything else. He settled in Virginia, worked as a translator at the Library of Congress, and lived quietly until his death in 1967. His obituary listed him as a refugee from Nazi Germany, which was true in every way that mattered. The agents who were never listed, whose names appeared in no official roster, whose work was never recognized by either side in the war, these ghosts of espionage left behind a legacy that intelligence agencies struggled to classify. They were failures, certainly, as agents, but they were also something else. Early defectors in a war of ideas that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War that followed World War II would be fought with armies and nuclear arsenals, but also with economics and culture, with the contrast between systems that restricted and systems that allowed. The Berlin airlift of 1948, dropping food and supplies to a blockaded city, was simply abundance as weapon made explicit. The Marshall Plan, rebuilding former enemies with unprecedented generosity, was the same principle on a continental scale. The United States had learned, perhaps without fully understanding the lesson, that its greatest strength lay not in its military might, but in its capacity for plenty, its messy freedom, its chaotic inclusiveness. Miller's confession, buried in classified files for decades, documented an early skirmish in this ideological war, a skirmish won not by counterintelligence officers or FBI agents, but by grocery stores and town hall meetings, by the casual abundance of a society that had never known real deprivation, by the simple fact of enough. The agents who vanished into American life carried with them a truth that would have seemed like propaganda if stated directly. That material prosperity and political freedom were not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths that could not be defeated by espionage or sabotage. They had been sent to observe the enemy's vulnerabilities, and instead discovered that the enemy had a weapon for which their training had not prepared them, the weapon of simply being what it claimed to be. April 1946, Virginia countryside. Heinrich Müller, no longer Oberst, no longer handler of invisible agents, now simply Henry Miller, translator, walks along a country road outside Washington. Spring has come to America with the same abundance that characterizes everything else here. Dogwood trees bloom white and pink. Wildflowers crowd the roadside. The air smells of growing things, earth warming after winter, the promise of summer. He stops at a small general store, the kind that dots rural America like punctuation marks in a long pastoral sentence. Inside, shelves are stocked with goods in quantities he has learned to accept but never quite believe. He purchases bread, white bread, soft and wrapped in cheerful paper, and walks outside to eat it in the spring sunshine. A car passes, radio playing music through open windows. Someone waves, a stranger's casual greeting that expects nothing in return. Miller waves back, the gesture automatic now, learned through months of practice. He thinks of his agents, scattered across this vast country, living lives they had been trained to fake, but which became real through the simple passage of days. He thinks of Klaus, attending synagogue with a family that accepted him, of Greta, fighting for workers' rights with the passion of a true believer, of Peter and Friedrich and Marie and all the others whose names he gave to interrogators who documented them in files that would remain sealed for 40 years. He wonders if any of them ever think of him, if they remember the training, the mission, the ideology that sent them here. But mostly he thinks about bread. Not the bread in his hand, though that is part of it. He thinks about all the bread he saw in reports, in descriptions, in the recurring theme that ran through his agents' observations like a thread connecting their separate experiences. Bread as symbol of everything Germany had promised and failed to deliver. Bread as the simplest, most fundamental representation of what happens when a system trusts its people with freedom. The Reich had lasted 12 years, not 1,000. It had promised strength through unity, greatness through purity, glory through sacrifice. And it had been defeated not just by armies, but by the simple, devastating fact that its enemies ate better, lived better, dreamed bigger. The agents he had sent to exploit democracy's weakness had instead discovered that the weakness was a strength in disguise, that chaos was productive, that diversity was powerful, that abundance was not decadence, but foundation. Müller finishes the bread, crumples the wrapper, and continues walking. Behind him, the store's screen door bangs shut as another customer enters. Ahead, the road curves into distance, into a future he could not have imagined when he began this work 8 years ago in a Berlin office that no longer exists in a city divided between victors. He had been a handler of invisible agents, and in the end, they had handled him. They had pulled him across the divide between ideologies not through argument or coercion, but through the simple testimony of their lives. They had shown him what he had tried for so long not to see, that the other side of this war was not perfect, not without flaws or injustices, but it was better. It was enough. It was, in the most profound sense, sufficient. And sufficiency, he understood now, was something for which people would abandon empires, betray oaths, risk everything. Because sufficiency meant that tomorrow might be better than today. That effort could yield reward, that children might inherit not glory or purity or strength, but simply the chance to live as they chose. The agents who were never listed had chosen that chance, one by one, report by report, until their mission dissolved into the ordinary miracle of American life. The War of Armies had ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. But the war of ideas, the war that Müller's invisible network had been fighting without, knowing they were on both sides of it, that war would continue for decades, across continents, in the contrast between walls built to keep people in and borders that people fought to cross. And in that longer war, the testimony of agents who betrayed their mission by living ordinary lives would echo forward as evidence of which system carried the seeds of its own perpetuation and which carried the seeds of its inevitable collapse. Müller walks on, a ghost in the machine of history, carrying secrets that are no longer secret and memories of a network that succeeded by failing. The bread is gone, digested into sustenance, but its meaning remains. Simple, profound, and ultimately unanswerable by any ideology that fears the chaos of freedom. In the end, the agents who were never listed won their war by losing it, and the handler who trained them learned that some battles cannot be won by intelligence alone, only by the intelligence to recognize when the other side is not an enemy at all, but simply what you might have been if the bread had always been enough.